So my background largely is in trauma and trauma-informed therapy. Before joining Mindful Psychology Associates, I did work in community mental health with children who've experienced abuse and neglect. And now I do work with children 10 and above, as well as adolescents, young adults, and adults and parents that really just kind of I've joined the private practice world. And so that's a little bit about me. So this presentation, the goal of it is to kind of go over what is trauma, how do we define it, what are we experiencing now that we're going through a pandemic that has been going on for 2.5, almost 3 years, how is that impacting the way our brain can communicate with itself, how is it impacting our ability to relate to others, because there's a biological basis to kind of some of the behaviors that you're seeing taking place. And it has a lot to do with the mechanisms inside our brains that are responsible for helping us survive. So generally speaking, what is trauma? Judith Herman, in her book, Trauma and Recovery, has a very nice explanation that I like to refer to. It's literally trauma is something that shatters one's belief that the world is a generally good and safe place. So it literally takes away the option for us that the world can be generally good or kind or compassionate, and it leaves us with the expectation that the world is going to be overwhelming, lead us to feel helpless, very vulnerable and frightened. Usually this shattering of your core belief that the world is a generally good and safe place happens through something like ongoing abuse, neglect, sexual assault, domestic violence, incarceration of a parent, separation from a parent, or some sort of kind of shock to the system. Once you get experience stress that's prolonged, the idea, and this is the last bullet, is that it presents itself as a toxic stress response in our body. When I say toxic stress response, it means it's basically that our stress response has kind of taken over and become overdetermined. So it's essentially wiring us to look for threat consistently and chronically where there isn't threat. So our brains will literally they'll filter out that there isn't any threat and only see threat where there isn't any. And so that's literally just from the exposure over and over and over again, where we make the association that the world is not a generally good and safe place, that everything we look at, interpret, perceive, then becomes filtered through that lens of I'm going to get hurt or I'm going to be left helpless or something like that. So when we think about our trauma response, it's synonymous with stress response. We all have it. I have it, you have it, my dog has it, my cats have it. It's literally what we would generically refer to as our fight, flight, freeze response. So when we're presented with a threat, usually our brain interprets it as a lethal threat. We tend to have 3 options. There's actually a 4th option that I haven't included on the slide, but it's kind of a subset of freeze. It's called fawning or feigning death. So when you are, let's use this. You are in a room, you're stuck in a room with a tiger. I pick tigers because tigers are my favorite animals, but you're stuck in a room with a tiger. Basically, all of us are going to come up with either fighting the tiger to kill it, to get away from it, figuring out how to run away from the tiger, or staying really, really still and hoping that that tiger doesn't see us and loses interest. The other option, the 4th one, where I'm calling fawning or feigning death, that would also be like playing dead. So essentially, I'm already dead. I'm of no interest. Like you can leave me alone, tiger. Like I'm not interesting to you. And so when you think about fight, flight, freeze, or fawn in people, fight, pretty much, you get the aggression, you get the person who's willing to be very confrontational, and also willing to fight for whatever they need to. And a lot of times when you think about the trauma response versus the stress response, the trauma response is that overdetermined part I was talking about. It's where the person has the fight response to something they're perceiving as threatening because they're in hypervigilance, but it may not be. And so they kind of over respond. Flight, withdrawal, avoidance, running away. Flight is literally what it means. Freeze tends to be, especially when you're looking at younger kids, or when you're looking at adults who have survived sexual assault, freeze tends to be the most common coping mechanism that young children and anyone who survived sexual assault chooses. It's kind of their default. The reason for that is that our brains are pretty smart. And if we are experiencing a penetrating wound of any type, so if we were stabbed with something, or in a sexual assault, there's penetration, if you think about it, it's actually better for us not to move a lot because there's penetration where it could damage a major organ. So a response becomes to freeze and not move. And so there's, in our brains, this response to basically fight, flight, freeze, fawn is primitive and reflexive. So it doesn't have any thought, it doesn't have any emotion to it, and it actually happens before we can even recognize we're in it. And so if you think about any sort of penetrative trauma, freeze is a really good option. Freeze is also a really good option for children because they're not bigger than the adult. Odds are they're not faster than the adult. So freeze becomes one of those things where, you just cross your fingers and hope that tiger just forgets that you're there. The fawning or feigning death is a dissociative response. So when people talk about leaving their body or watching it from above or disconnecting from any pain, that's a fawn response, because essentially fight, flight, freeze, our stress response is built to activate our cardiovascular system and get oxygenated blood to our muscles. And basically it takes blood away from our stomach and our intestines. So we're not interested in digestion anymore. We're doing all the things to get our arms and legs ready to do fight to the death, run away for as long as you need to, stay really, really still. And then fawning or feigning death actually is why it's a dissociative response. It's an understanding that the most primitive part of our brain has, that there's no escape. And so what it does is it essentially tries to make whatever lethal threat you are facing as least painful as possible. So there's a lot of releasing of endorphins and opioid type neurotransmitters that help with pain relief and whatever. And that's why you get the disconnect from your body. So people will say, I'm looking up above, that they're describing a disconnect from the connection with their body. And so it's kind of like they go inside themselves, but they go inside themselves in their head, and they just disconnect from the body, because the idea with feigning death is that escape is not possible. Death is probably imminent, so let's make it as painless as possible. And again, if that feigning death and things like that is to separate yourself from your body, when you think about PTSD and trauma symptoms, a lot of it is that lack of connection between your mind and what's going on in your body, and you did it for a good reason. And there's huge respect for that coping mechanism. But then what happens is feelings actually, and our intuition, are felt experiences. And so if we cut off, the connection to our body, we lose out on the information that our body stores. And I'm going to go into a little bit about how our brain works and just how it's organized. And then also the impact of, if you have some sort of assault or injury early on in life, there's a reason why you see certain maladaptive coping skills develop later on.
I have a question.
Go for it.
So when you said when one thinks death is imminent, like say you're in a car accident and you just know that the impact of this crash, you're just gonna go.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying that your body goes through the separation? You separate yourself from the
Yep.
body?
So your body, so the stress response is to get all the blood flowing to your arms, your legs, you start breathing faster, your heart rate's going fast.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
When you're in the fawning or feigning in the dissociative response, it's actually the opposite. Your heart rate slows down to stop, to like stop the major bleeding.
Okay.
You release a ton of pain relieving and feel good endorphins to
Mm-hmm.
just basically make it as least traumatic as possible.
Okay.
But what ends up happening is then you disconnect from what the experience is. So even though your body is releasing all this to try to make death, the impact of death less traumatic,
Mm-hmm.
you actually then disconnect from your body, and your body is what stores the memory of the traumatic event. So
Okay.
if you were to pass on from that, your body did what it needed to do. Is
Mm-hmm.
it made it as least traumatic as possible. But
Right.
if you survive, then what the difference is you've got memory in your brain, you've got memory stored in your body, and there's no communication between the two. So it feels like you're in it again and again and again,
Mm-hmm.
or you just check out. Any feeling or sensation in your body then becomes overdetermined, and you say, okay, this is lethally threatening, and it's actually just a feeling. So then your body's like, nope, I'm out.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense. And my other question is, how about, I always picture myself as, if you feel like death is imminent, that you will bring on like cardiac arrest or something due to the fear.
Mm-hmm.
Is that another way of dealing with it?
It could be. So one of the things about the stress response or the trauma response is we all have one that we just intuitively go to.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we use that, and whatever the trauma is
Mm-hmm.
that happens, and we survive it,
Mm-hmm.
then we are more likely to use that one again. So
Okay.
if I were to think about, putting yourself in a sudden cardiac arrest, maybe that would be amping yourself up into fight, or maybe that would be amping yourself up to flight, where you just run so far that you just can't.
Okay.
The idea is that we kind of all have a default, and once we use that default once, it kind of becomes a pattern, and then anytime that it represents itself, we
Mm-hmm.
then tend to go down the same pathway. And so these tend to get ingrained in us. If we're thinking about trauma, it tends to get ingrained in us when we're young.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why you see individuals who experience adversity early in life, they tend to have very ingrained ways of dealing with interpersonal space and boundaries and whatever. And that's because time after time after time they were exposed with a threat. They used fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and it was
Right.
successful. So then they just kept doing it because they didn't get
Okay.
any feedback not to.
Okay. Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
So if someone went into fawn and it really worked, and they didn't, they don't remember a lot from the car accident, and they weren't really feeling any pain in their body, I mean, it'll become maladaptive, but in the moment it was good. That's the tricky part about our stress response. In the moment, if there is a lethal threat, it's awesome. I love it.
Yeah.
I'm glad I have it. I don't want to not have it. The
Mm-hmm.
problem is when you're thinking of PTSD and trauma, is that your brain is now seeing trauma everywhere, and it's not everywhere. So it's not helping you anymore.
Okay.
Tiger's not in the room anymore.
Okay. Gotcha.
In other words, could somebody who experienced a trauma and played dead and then comes back into the moment, say, to go to their friend's funeral, loses it and has a heart attack?
What do you mean?
Okay, I'm probably misdescribing this a little bit. The little girl in Uvalde, the 10-year-old,
Yes.
she literally played dead, covering herself with her friend's blood. And then she had to come back into the moment to go to her friend's funeral a couple days ago, and she had a heart attack at the funeral.
Yeah.
Because she was totally attached at that moment.
Yeah.
Where she was detached at the moment of the incident.
Yeah.
And everything just hit her at once.
Yeah.
it's like, so she could develop a maladaptive response where she always plays dead when something happens,
Yep,
because it worked. It saved her life. She'll
it
never
absolutely
forget seeing her friend dead.
correct. So, and that's where the disconnect in the threatening part, when the danger was happening and the shooter was in the school or whatever, like her instincts just jumped in, and that's how she survived. And then she faces a reminder of that same lethal threat, but a completely different response takes over because she's actually in her body.
Because I noticed, even with myself, I am a victim of trauma. I was abused as a kid. So there's a certain person that reminds me of my father that is a prominent politician. He would say he's not a politician, but he is, because he was president. And every time I see him, especially when he was president, I would just go into this anxiety mode because he reminded me so much of my father, even though he was not a drinker, but the way he acted. And it was
Yep.
scarier because he knew what he was doing.
Right.
My father, I could rationalize that he didn't know what he was doing because he was drunk.
Right.
And it's like, it's scary. It's like, yeah. And I would close up my legs and everything because he was of the things he was accused of. Just seeing him on TV, I was never in a room with this guy alone, and I would never put myself in that situation because I don't trust him.
Yeah.
But it's like, that's a trauma. That is a trauma response, because I would have severe anxiety attacks after seeing him on television. I had to stop watching the news during the pandemic, mostly because he came on every day during our local news at like 5 o'clock, right before the evening news. I'm like, this isn't fair. I can't watch the news because he's got to take up the time. And it's like, yeah, okay. All we had at that time also was COVID news and stuff, which is stressful enough.
Right.
But that wasn't causing the anxiety response that he did, because that was me getting information, because I would follow everything I was told every time something changed. It was nerve-wracking to change it.
Yep.
But it's like, yes, that was because of the change, I think, is why the pandemic, the sudden change was why it was so traumatic to have that pandemic and it go the way it did.
And part of where we're going to go into like the neurobiology of complex trauma is going to help explain why you went there as soon as you had reminders of
that is why I wanted to hear the presentation.
There you go.
About.
Yeah, so there is a biological reason for it. And I mean, I appreciate you very much for sharing your story. It takes a lot of courage to bring that forward. And this is my hope with this, is to give you an understanding. Biologically, there's something happening inside of you that if any of us had experienced what you had experienced, we would come up with similar ways of kind of coping and defending ourselves that then kind of pop up when we're adults, that we, kind of are like, what is going on? And this doesn't match the situation. So just bear with me, and any questions that come up, just ask. The first domain of what we think about when we think about the development of our brain and trauma experienced early in life. One of the important facets of the brain is that it's organized in a hierarchical fashion, which means that information enters the lowest part of our brain first, which is our brainstem. And our brainstem is the part of our brain that is responsible for regulatory functions. So it makes sure that we swallow our spit, it makes sure we remember to breathe, it makes sure we remember to blink, it beats our heart. And it's none of this stuff we have to think about. We just automatically do it because it's regulated by our brainstem. Then if you go a little higher up in the brain, there's the middle part of the brain, which is known as the limbic system. The limbic system is where our memories are stored, but they're not stored with words. They're stored as memory in our body. And also our emotions are stored. So a lot of people think thoughts come before feelings. It's actually the other way around. You have a feeling, which then triggers a thought. And the part of our brain that does that is in the middle. It's the limbic system. And then the highest part of our brain is the prefrontal cortex, which is right where your forehead is. And that's what makes us really, really good at being students or, teachers or at our jobs. It's responsible for all of our executive functioning, our ability to pay attention, our ability to, remember facts, our ability to put a story to the feelings that we have in our body. Also the ability to mediate our stress response if our brain can communicate effectively. For example, if you see out of the corner of your eye, or if you're walking in your yard and you see something that looks like a snake, your brainstem's going to jump in and have you do some sort of response. So it's either going to fight, flight, freeze. It probably wouldn't fawn, but if you might fawn. But the part of the prefrontal cortex is that it would reason with you that, you know what, in Illinois, we don't really have a lot of poisonous snakes. The likelihood of that isn't high. And the prefrontal cortex could then reason or mediate your dysregulated brainstem, which thinks there's a threat, and actually convince you to look again. And if you look again, you could tell that it's just a garden hose and there's actually no problem.
And I have a question. How does having conditions like ADHD or autism complicate those things? I'm asking because I have the two conditions.
Sure. So ADHD and autism, a lot of the way out of trauma is the same way in. So if you've experienced trauma, trauma happens in relationship and is healed in relationship. ADHD has a lot to do with executive functioning and the ability to track things and, keep track of things, know what to pay attention to when. And so if you have experienced trauma, if you have a lens that the world is generally not a good and safe place, the things that your brain is primed to look for are not the things that other people are looking for. Because if you think about what the context would be for you, that people out there are dangerous, well, let's say 85% of the people out there are walking around and they don't have any idea that other people are dangerous. What they're able to pay attention to and what you're able to pay attention to is very different. And what you focus on and what they focus on is different. And as far as autism spectrum disorders, if trauma happens in relationship and is healed in relationship, a lot of those interpersonal habits or skills or anything like that, they're interrupted. And they may be interrupted for good reason, but also if they're interrupted, then it makes it much harder to heal from trauma because it's harder to engage in that interpersonal space. For example, one of the ways to calm your stress response can be through touch or eye contact or tone of voice, which all get interrupted by those additional diagnoses, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense because I know I've had trouble healing from the trauma because, and these are two also lifelong conditions. So if I have them now, I had them when I was a kid. Both were just, the ADHD was just recently confirmed within the last 5-10 years, and the autism was just diagnosed within the last 5 years.
And so that's something where, sensory integration sorts of treatment can be helpful. Also, thinking about how the brain is organized can also be helpful in thinking about interventions. So if we go with the premise that the brain is organized from the bottom up, so it's organized in a hierarchical fashion. And so what that means is that we need our brain stems to be regulated in order for our limbic system to stay online. In order for our prefrontal cortex to understand what our limbic system is, our limbic system has to be regulated. So our brain is a very efficient organ, and so it creates sets of associations. And all that is required for a set of association is a pattern of two co-occurring things happening at the same time and it happening more than once. So that could be anything. And so if you start to have associations when you're young that are that you've associated with threat, it literally will trigger your arousal system. And so the information, because it's out of survival, will never go past your brainstem. So you're never going to be able to be in touch with the thoughts, feelings, reactions you have about it, because you're literally just trying to survive the moment. So from that, also the brain develops from the bottom up and the inside out. So when we're born, our brain stems tend to be pretty much developed and pretty much organized. And then how we learn how to regulate our stress response comes from our primary caregiver. So if you've ever been around an infant, they cry at anything. They cry if they're wet, they cry if they're hungry, they cry if they just want to be held. All of that is they're experiencing distress or dysregulation. A good enough and attuned enough caregiver comes, picks up the baby, rocks the baby, feeds the baby, changes the baby's diaper, whatever. And then the distress is regulated. So they're regulated externally by their caregiver. And it happens over and over and over again. I mean, if you've ever been around an infant, you have to do this multiple times a day throughout every day until, the kid gets older. What's happening in that pattern repetition is the child is making associations that when I am hungry and then I'm fed, when I'm fed, this is what it feels like to feel fed. And now I'm okay. So even though there aren't any words being exchanged or explanations being exchanged, the child is becoming familiar with their body. And then as we get older, limbic system development tends to happen in school age or, middle school. And then you've kind of got the prefrontal cortex happening, in teenager, adolescent, late adolescent, young adult. And so what the important piece of this concept is that if the lower part of your brainstem is poorly organized, so it doesn't have a map for how to soothe you or what soothing feels like, then all of the information is filtered through being poorly organized. So then your limbic system becomes poorly organized. So you have people who can't identify feelings or can't remember things. Their memory is really spotty, or when, they can't remember important things. And that's because, again, the dysregulation, their brain continues to develop. I'm not saying that someone who's experienced trauma is only living like their brainstem is the only part of their brain. We all have our full brain. It's that it doesn't communicate efficiently or effectively. So we can't mediate if our brainstem is on fire telling us we're in danger and there's a tiger in the room, that's all we're going to pay attention to until that tiger is gone. If we can have an organized brainstem, we can reason with ourselves as we get older and we're not infants to tell ourselves the tiger isn't really there. But in order to do that, you can't be in your stress response, because in your stress response, you're just doing everything out of reflex. So in conjunction with that, neurons, or the pathways in our brain and how our brain communicates with itself they change in a use-dependent fashion. So the statement is use it or lose it. So with the idea of the infant, if the infant cries and the needs get met and they start to make the connection between when I cry, this need gets met, you'll even see parents who are good, like attached enough or good enough, attuned, that they can actually determine what cry their kid is doing. Oh, that cry means the kid is hungry. And so then they'll meet that need. And so that happens repeatedly as the child develops. And what that ends up, what that does inside the brain is it creates neural pathways that tell them when I have a need, I can express it and it gets met. So if a child's exposed to neglect, abuse, constant fear, they're going to have significant problems in all domains of development because they don't have the neural pathways that a person would if they grew up with the idea that the world is a generally good and safe place, because their neural pathways are wired for that people are out to get me. So then some neural systems can be changed. Some are easier than others. Boy, oh boy, is this a good thing. I do not want my brain stem to be plastic or flexible or anything like that. I want it to be rigid, because if I ever get confronted with a tiger, I want that part of my brain to take over and help me figure out how the heck to get away from the tiger. That said, if the lower part of the brain isn't as plastic, if it's the part of you that started off poorly organized, never really got well organized or regulated, it will be the part that leaves you acting from a more primitive and reflexive space than from a place that has insight, that a place that has feeling, that a place that has thought or memory. I mean, if you think about it, if a tiger were to walk in my room right now, I mean, I'm very attached to my dog. The attachment between my dog and would be severed, because I would become extremely focused on myself and extremely focused on the tiger. I wouldn't be worried about what am I going to eat for lunch tomorrow. I wouldn't be worried about how am I going to pay my bills. I wouldn't be worried about anything. All I'd be focusing on is that tiger. And that's a good thing when a tiger's actually there. But when the tiger's not there, but you're perceiving the tiger to be there, it interrupts all sorts of capabilities that make us successful in our daily lives, which is what's happening with the pandemic. We are being reminded over and over and over again that we're not safe. And so when people don't feel safe, they tend to start responding from a more primitive part of themselves, which is not very interpersonal. And so it can look selfish, it can look erratic, it can look just downright mean. And that's, again, people are in fight, flight, freeze. I mean, they're picking one. And so unfortunately, a lot of what we're seeing is people are going into fight. They're getting really selfish. They're feeling like their needs or wants are being impinged upon. And so, but they're also constantly being reminded of that they're under threat. So therefore, that's how you get these situations, biologically speaking.
How do you deal with the denial that some people do? Because that's what we saw a lot of with the pandemic. Oh, this isn't as bad as they're making it. They're lying about the numbers. They're doing this, they're doing that. But you can see it all around you.
Yeah.
How do you deny what you see with your own eyes?
So when we talk about, trauma and everything that we have very sophisticated coping mechanisms, denial is one of them. And so think about dissociation of kind of separating yourself from your body. So your mind and your body are kind of separate. You're not feeling the horrible things that are going on in your body. You're watching it from above. It's happening to someone else. A sophisticated way of that, not that dissociation isn't sophisticated, it's very sophisticated. But one, a spin-off of that is denial. This isn't happening. It's not what they say it is. And it's a way to deal with the overwhelming, if you were really to sit and think about and feel, like a lot of us are, how this pandemic feels, it takes you down a peg or two or three. It can be very overwhelming. It can lead you to feeling helpless and hopeless. And so denial becomes a way of avoiding that feeling. I don't like feeling helpless or hopeless.
No one likes it.
No one likes it. Yeah. So some people choose the trick of denial.
Which is why 12-step programs are so difficult. Step 1 is about admitting your powerlessness over whatever.
Yes. And so if you think about it, if a person has chosen denial as a way to get through this chronic reminder that they're in stress, they're under threat and they're distressed, they still have thoughts and feelings about it. They just can't access it. Like, that's the thing about the neurobiology of trauma, is you still have memory, you still have feelings. You don't have labels for the memory, you don't have label or a story for the memory or labels for the feeling, but you still have it. And so what ends up happening, and why people see PTSD, or like when you treat PTSD, what do you see? You see that there's a backlog of these memories in this person's body. And the goal is to experience it, experience the feeling that you had when it was happening, because it's not happening anymore, and having someone bear witness. So if a tiger was in the room with me right now, I would have no clue what I was feeling or thinking, but I am feeling and thinking things, and I'm storing it in my body. And the goal would be so that I don't develop maladaptive coping skills. After I got away from the tiger, I would talk to somebody and reveal what I was thinking and feeling while I was in that room. I would receive validation and confirmation that yeah, absolutely, that sounds awful, that sounds scary. And then through the relationship, I would be able to re-regulate myself. And it goes back to, again, that's why, this concept here of the brain develops most rapidly early in life. That's why when you see children or adults who've experienced trauma from a young age, you see so many domains of impairment, is because it all comes back to they didn't get the repetition and the experience with regulating their stress response, which is one of the first tasks we do once we're born. And if you can't regulate your brainstem and you can't access what you're thinking and what you're feeling, then it becomes really hard to stay in your body, to tell other people what's going on, to have labels for what's going on. I mean, you can see how all of a sudden all the dominoes are falling down, and it's because that individual hasn't even figured out how to get their body to just settle. And that's a tall order. And so a lot of what I do as a therapist for any age range is when you're having a distressing feeling, or when something is overwhelming or overstimulating, your body somehow communicates to you something that it wants. So it's usually through the five senses. Again, that has a lot to do with, because it's your brainstem. So some people really like touch. I can tell you I'm really oriented to sound. So if you gave me like a novel sound, I would listen to that sound and I'd become curious about it. And curiosity is the way out of our biologically instinctual stress response. When you're faced a tiger, you're not curious about anything. You're just focused on, I'm going to get the heck out of here and I'm going to focus minute to minute. But when you're learning, or when you're like when children play, the primary feeling that they have is curiosity. And curiosity is what opens up the channels for our brain to communicate effectively with itself.
Well, that's
Fear.
because what I would do instead of watch news reports about COVID is I started reading scientific journal articles about COVID and how they were treating it and what they were developing in terms of clinical trials to learn. And that seemed to cure a lot of the anxiousness about the pandemic itself, but not about other things that were going on around that other people were doing. So I actually had to tune the news out for a while.
Yeah. And that I want you to know it's completely normal. I went through stages of that as well, because again, it is we can only handle or tolerate. That's what that toxic stress that I was talking about in the beginning. There's only so much we can handle or tolerate or even integrate into our everyday functioning. And this pandemic has been a doozy. And then on top of that, people have responded to the thoughts, feelings, and reactions of being under threat in very, very different ways. And it all goes back to our stress response. Some people are inclined to fight. Some people are inclined to flight. Some people are inclined to freeze. Other people are inclined to dissociate. So they're inclined to just deny, and this isn't happening, or it's not real.
What happens when your body tries to do all three at the same time? Because that's what happened to me a couple of times, and it caused a really bad anxiety response that actually sent me to the ER.
Do you have a panic attack?
I did.
Okay.
Two that sent me to the emergency room during the pandemic, and actually the doctor said, don't worry, there are people who don't normally have these that are having them now because of the pandemic.
So a panic attack is still one of the stress responses. You'd have to describe the panic. My bet would be flight, but you weren't able to actually flee. So what happens is
Starts out as like, it becomes a violent shaking. There are times when my blood pressure, the one time my blood pressure shot up way too high. It went back down normal again. and I would throw up and have all kinds of, and in fact, my stress response once actually scared somebody. They said, go get tested for COVID. I
Yeah.
went to the hospital and they told me, no, you don't have COVID. You're having a panic attack.
Yeah. So that panic, so the shaking, the, throwing up, if you think about the basis of what our stress response does is it's responsible for getting oxygenated blood. So our heart rate increases, our breath becomes more shallow, blood starts to flow to our extremities versus our internal organs. That's why some people, when they actually are you get distressed, they actually will lose bladder or bowel function. So like they'll pee themselves or something like that, is because they're making themselves lighter so that they can get away from, they're just getting rid of everything.
Seem to revert to bedwetting when they have a trauma.
Correct. And so for panic, the other part that's happening is those endorphins. I told you with dissociation, feel good endorphins go out and your body tries to make it as painless and as least traumatic as possible. When you're in fight, flight, freeze, the adrenaline is coursing through you. And if you've ever had adrenaline and you tried to control it, it makes your whole body tremble and it makes your heart race. And it's very uncomfortable.
It makes you tired for 2 or 3 days afterwards.
Yeah, it's like you've literally been run over by a truck. And that is a combination of your body preparing to fight or run. And then on top of that, the adrenaline. And if you are perceiving a threat that you cannot get away from and your whole body goes through that, that is a panic attack.
Yep.
It's incredibly, and it's incredible. Panic attacks are incredibly difficult on your body. I mean, that's why people think that they're having a heart attack and whatever, is that it creates that much somatic experience in your body. And it's it's literally that you're like stuck in the stress response and it's trying so hard to discharge. Well, the discharge of it would be fighting someone physically, and running away.
Able to complete the cycle yet on the stress of the pandemic. It's still here.
Yeah. And that's part of, why I go through how does trauma impact the development of the brain? Because we have an entire generation of children at this point who have experienced adversity in childhood. So there's a study that I go into further, and I know I'm running out of time, but this has been really helpful. There's a study, the ACE study, which was done in 1997, and they were actually studying stress and obesity. But what they found out was, and I'll just go to that slide so you can see it, is that adversity experienced early in life, and this is the adversity they're talking about: emotional, physical, sexual abuse, exposure to community violence, incarceration of parent, poverty, death of a loved one or parent, disruption in caregiving, whatever. Children who experience that are more likely to experience chronic illness, disease, or disability later in life. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If developmentally they experience an injury, which then has their brain wired to perceive threat all the time and is not successfully or wired or organized for them to figure out what is soothing to them, they are more likely to use drugs or substances. They're more likely to be labeled the problem child in school or have disruptive behavior because, again, they struggle with regulation, which then leads to the adoption of risky behaviors, whether it's sexual acting out, drug use, smoking, attempting suicide, self-harm. And so then all of those behaviors, it's dose dependent. The more you experience early in life, it lowers your trajectory. So you're leading yourself to early death. And that makes sense, because if you adopt risky behaviors, for example, like drinking alcohol or doing drugs, you're more likely to then experience some sort of medical side effects from that. So this study was done to study obesity, and what they stumbled upon was that individuals who experience adversity early in life are more likely to have more chronic medical problems, not even mental issues, but medical issues related to the fact that they experienced this early in life, and it's dose dependent. So if we have an entire generation of children who've experienced one ACE for sure, and according to, the CDC and everything, at least 50 to 60% of our population already before the pandemic experienced at least one ACE, then think about what that means.
How about vicariously experiencing it through seeing it on television as opposed to directly experiencing it in person?
Yep. And so here's the idea of vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma happens to people who, usually first responders, things like that, but in this pandemic, being chronically exposed to the fact that we're not safe, having all these issues come up in the news,
The school shootings.
Yep, the school shootings.
That's what I was thinking of more, because I went through all the childhood stuff about being in school, and I'm like, wait a minute, school shouldn't be unsafe. When I was in grade school, it was safe. We did not have people with AR-15s going in and shooting us.
Right. And so vicarious trauma, or vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, some people call burnout, whatever. Vicarious trauma is essentially when someone has not been directly exposed to a lethal threat directly. So like they haven't been in a lethal car accident, they haven't experienced abuse, neglect, whatever, but they experience it or learn about it from either, news, constantly getting, constant exposure to that. Therapists are also can be exposed to vicarious trauma, first responders, doctors, anything like that. And essentially what that means is the individuals who were not directly exposed to the traumatic or lethal event still develop the same schemas or the same meaning-making systems within them, that their needs for safety are not going to be met, they can't trust others, that people in power, are not trustworthy, the world is not a good and it's not a generally good and safe place. So vicarious trauma means that you may not have necessarily yourself experienced the lethal threat, but being exposed to it often enough, it alters your frames of reference, your abilities to enjoy yourself or self-soothe. It interferes with your ability to navigate interpersonal dynamics, and it makes you, second guess your access to safety or trust or intimacy or control. And it can also have disturbances in your memory, in, how your brain kind of works or talks to itself, or bodily sensations. And all of that goes back to, because the part of us that helps us survive threat is our brainstem. And so our brainstem effectively takes our limbic system and our prefrontal cortex offline. All that means is your brain is now using all of itself. It's only using this primitive and reflexive part. So then what happens is the person does not integrate their thoughts and feelings about what's going on. The person does not have a narrative for what's going on. It's literally stored in their body.
That would be what is causing all this blow up after we are able to go back out after the pandemic, or after it's somewhat over. It's not over. And people don't trust each other, no matter who. We didn't have a lot of contact during the pandemic. Zoom conferences are no substitute for physically being in person. I found that difficult. School was not difficult for me online, but church is something I need to be in person at. But there's been shootings in churches too. So,
right. And this is the concept you're talking about here, the isolation. That's another part of our biology here. Our brain is designed and wired to be in relationship with other people. We are not designed to live on our own and be in isolation. And you hit the nail on the head. This pandemic has asked us to stay in forced isolation for a prolonged period of time. So that automatically will impact our concept of the world, our concept of ourselves, our concept of others. And if you think about not long ago, we were in a relational milieu or a relational environment where children under the age of 6 had at least 4 or more adults in their lives that would protect them, nurture them, and so forth. At this point, we now have, and it's reversed. And usually there are 4 children to 1 adult. So if I'm thinking about, just nurseries, daycares, whatever. And also the ability for, sorry, cats are running around like crazy. The ability for, extended family to take part in raising a child and everything. Like we've got a lot more separation. Then in comes the pandemic, and our separation that was already there and kind of already not helping us be those social creatures that we needed to be actually gave us the message of the opposite. Don't be social, it's dangerous. And that kind of puts us in a quandary, because if we're social beings and we're wired to be in relationship with others, but the message that we get is being in relationship with others is dangerous, you can understand how people then come up with a meaning-making system of that other people are not generally good and safe.
I think that's an excellent point. Staying at home or working from home, it was okay probably those first few weeks, and
Yeah.
after a while, I was raring to go back. I asked to go back. So me and a friend of mine, she was having a hard time
Yeah.
with the being at home. She wanted to go back to work as well.
Yeah. And then it's like, and I was the same way. And then I found myself when I went back, I didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
Like I didn't know how to talk to people. I felt really vulnerable and like unsure. And a lot of it too is that if, a lot of this perception about threat or lethality of, experiences or perceptions happens outside of our awareness. So I can't even describe to you how impactful it is to go outside and see everyone wearing a mask, that our brains are interpreting that in ways that we probably don't even understand. And so we're never getting out of chronic threat. We're always in it. And then we've got news, we've got,
I've
issues
experienced
happening.
more anxiety now. I wear a mask everywhere I go still.
Yeah.
Sometimes 2. And then when I see someone, when I'm close in contact, like a crowded bus or train, and that people without masks, I'm like, I don't want to be here. Now, if it's a train where I can move away, fine. There was actually a bus. I was in a bus situation where I had to actually get off the bus because a truckload of teenagers got on, none of them wearing masks. I'm like, oh boy, COVID heaven.
Yeah.
Even though most of them were probably vaccinated, because a lot of us around in the Evanston area and Evanston Wilmette got vaccinated. But
well, if think about it. So here's a good visual that I like about how, so this is a PET scan. A PET scan is imaging of the brain, and its response, the PET scans let us know what part of our brain is most active. And like what part of our brain are we using to basically, filter through the information that we're receiving. So red means it's super active. Black means there's no activity. The part of the brain is still there. It's just not doing anything. And then you kind of, you go from there. So if you think about someone who grew up with a relative, like a good enough childhood and a healthy childhood with no experience of adversity early on, you can see that when the brain is doing a task, pretty much all of it is engaged in the task and working together, and the brain is communicating. There's really not any holes anywhere, like all the parts of the brain light up. You'll also notice that the front part of the brain, which is at the top of the screen, is lit up more than the bottom part of the brain in red, which means that they're using more of their prefrontal cortex than their brainstem. If you look at somebody who's experienced abuse and neglect and how their brain communicates with itself, that brainstem lights up like crazy. So that's the part that's doing most of the filtering of information and passing it along to the higher parts of the brain. You'll see the 2 circles are picking up, kind of like areas where nothing's really happening. Those 2 areas in our brain are responsible for us receiving language and being able to express language. So when you talk about ADHD or autism paired with trauma, trauma impacts your ability to understand language being spoken to you and your ability to speak to other people about what's going on inside of you. And it's literally because the brain is so focused on the brainstem, and the behavior is coming from a reflexive place, and it's not even getting really to your limbic system where your feelings are stored and your memories are stored.
Can
And
you
so
get out of
then,
that pattern?
what?
Can you get out of that pattern?
Oh, of course. I wouldn't be a therapist if we couldn't do that. So what
I'm trying to get out of it. I've been trying for years. I am more out of it now than I would have been 5 years ago, but I still have a lot of reactions to a lot of things that I probably don't need to have reactions to.
So here's the way out. The way out is the way in, unfortunately. So if the way in, trauma happens in relationship, the way out is through relationship. So a lot of these skills, like self-regulatory skills, resilience, the ability to self-soothe and all that stuff is built through.
The pandemic interrupted my healing process by isolating me from direct contact with people.
I know. And so that part of that is reconnection. The other part of it is, I will tell you this, when you feel distress, or when you think of what is soothing to you, can you come up with something?
Listening to quiet music, watching nature videos, maybe going for a walk. It depends on the situation.
Okay. When you think about your five senses, which sense do you feel most oriented to?
Sound,
Sound.
both in terms of calm and danger.
Calm and danger. Okay.
Yes.
Do you have someone that you are very attached and attuned to and associate with safety?
My pastor, and I have a friend that I talk to all the time.
Okay. Would it be possible to get a recording from your friend or pastor? It can be anything. It can be like a little message to you.
Other thing that threw me during the pandemic, sometimes the news reporters that I was used to listening to were not on TV, and those voices are friendly. I know them. I like them.
So
they're comforting because of how they present.
Right. So what you want to do is seek out sounds like that. And the reason I'm picking your friend and your pastor is because you have that relational attachment to them. And so the idea would be the sound would help settle your stress response enough for your body to then tell you what you need. So for example, I'll use myself. I am a person who really prefers flight as my stress response. And my, when I'm faced with something, I would really like just to be able to run away. So when I am feeling overstimulated, distressed, dysregulated, whatever, the best thing I can do is take my dog, who's a foxhound, out to a forest preserve, because I am going there with something I am attached and bonded to, and it is the exact opposite sensation and experience of being trapped. When you feel trapped, you want to run, or if you feel trapped by a tiger, you want to fight it, or you want to freeze. So I take my dog, who I'm extremely attached to, and we go out into nature where literally it's the opposite of being trapped. There are no gates around me. There's no fences around me. I have space. It's literally, I allow myself to discharge the feeling of needing to get away by doing it in a way that's comforting and soothing. So for fight, deal with a lot of, if you deal with, adolescent boys, young adult men, a lot of times fight is what comes up. They get real angry and they want to fight. And of course, I don't want anyone to get physically violent with anyone else, but there are other ways you can discharge that feeling. You can throw eggs against a wall and break them.
Punch a pillow.
Punch a pillow. You can break dishes. You can take really thick notebooks and try to rip them in half. And that's a discharge of that feeling. So the feeling isn't in you anymore. You've let it go. And that would be the other thing that for you in particular, as you navigate this pandemic, if there are things that you can do to discharge some of these feelings that are kind of bouncing around inside of you, it'll make your ability to regulate easier, because they're getting in the way. They're triggering you.
Yes, yes. So sometimes it means just tuning everything out and laying down with quiet music on, or just nature sounds.
Yep.
Because I find getting back to nature very soothing too, because we're part of that ecosystem.
Yeah.
We
And
were created to be part of that.
yeah. And I mean, I know I'm over time, Irene, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. We started a little late. I did want to ask Judy a question. Judy, you know this is being recorded, and I know you've had a huge part of the discussion. Are you okay with this being posted
If
on
I
our
wasn't
YouTube?
okay, because I know coming to this and saying personal stuff, it's going to be posted. I don't care who hears it. It may help somebody.
Yes. Okay. I just had to ask. Thank you.
No.
And so
If I didn't want it posted, I shouldn't say it.
so I'm gonna leave it at this, because this is the general concept of why do I talk about the biology of what our stress response does and how it impacts our brain's ability to communicate with itself and communicate with others, is there really needs to be a paradigm shift throughout every strata of whatever functioning we have. We need to change the question from what is wrong with you to a question that asks what has happened to you. What is wrong with you focuses on behavior, and it literally makes it seem like there's a solution or that you can be fixed, when the reality is you don't need to be fixed. You just need to be understood in the context of your experience. So what happened to you? Because something, if we think about all the stuff I talked about the brain and how instinctual and reflexive it is, and how it, crazy advanced our brain can become with developing defense mechanisms, the behavior is there for a reason. And so instead of attacking the behavior and what is wrong with you and why are you doing that behavior, what's happened to you that behavior has now become your choice of coping? Whether it's drinking alcohol, doing drugs, whether it's fighting, whether it's hypersexuality, it doesn't matter. Something happened in that person's life where they felt that was a good way to cope, and it's not good anymore. So does that mean the person isn't good? No, it means that something happened to them that hasn't been resolved. And so if we can address what happened to them, they can learn a better way to cope. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
Yes,
so I think
it makes sense.
I think I'll leave it there. I'll stop sharing too so you guys can see me again. But
okay. I wanted to ask Leah, did you have any questions?
No, I don't. I didn't know how to unmute though. Thank you.
Okay. This was fantastic, Alison. Thank you for the presentation. So we will be uploading the presentation to our YouTube channel, our Evanston Public Library YouTube channel. Would you be providing your slides, or I just thought I'd ask?
I can send you an email with a PDF of them for sure.
Okay, great. And I'll send them out to you, Judy, and Leah.
Thank you. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Irene, for making this
I would
possible.
consider running this presentation again so more people might see it.
I agree, and I was thinking about that, and Alison, I think it would be great if it was even in person.
Yeah, I'm in.
Okay, I think that would be great. So we'll look to doing that in the future.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again.
Okay,
Alrighty.
thank you. Have a good night.
You too. Bye bye.